Alex Chemirov here at Movements for Life. For today's restorative segment, we're going to be doing some cage work as it relates to creating some mobility in the famous hamstrings. Major topic of conversation as it relates to mobility and flexibility. And before we dive into some of the techniques that we utilize in the true stretch, I think it helps to know the hamstrings, kind of where they are, origin, insertion, things like that, because flexibility is nothing more than taking both ends, i.e. the origin and insertion, and moving them further apart from one another. So in looking at each leg has three hamstrings, right? You have the bicep femoris, or femoris, depending on who your professor was, on the outer, and then you have the semimembranosus and semitendinosus on the inside. So the bicep fem could actually be further subdivided into a long head and a short head. So from a simplicity standpoint, they all insert under your sit bones, so under your butt, ischiotuberosity, and they make their way across the knee, and they essentially anchor on both ends there. So from a topographical anatomy standpoint, in college I learned that your hamstring will flex your knee, right? Here is your very common leg curl, regardless of whether you're doing it prone or seated, if you're in a gym. The other opposite end is to look at it being a hip extensor, right? So both of those examples are the concentric action of the hamstring. In function and in life, all your hinge patterns, so all your different deadlift hip dominant patterns, is going to load the hamstring group in hip flexion, right? So your hamstrings decelerate hip flexion, i.e. your deadlift, right? My hamstrings now are on stretch, so my hamstrings have to decelerate that. Now, why is that important? Well, life is all from the top down, right? When we look at how your hamstrings work, there's not many instances in life where I'm going to be going through and shortening my hamstring by kicking myself in the butt, unless I make a lot of repeated poor choices in my life. So I have to look at the eccentric action, because that is where life happens at its best, right? So if I'm going to step and reach down in front of me, well, my right hamstring in this example is decelerating my entire body if I'm going down to pick up my daughter and then pull her back up. So if I never train my hamstring how to do that, we can begin to see how my back is going to be put in a vulnerable state if my hamstring can't get into this posture, right? It's either going to go above or below. If my hammy can't do it, then I'm going to start going more knee dominant squatty, or I'm going to get really, really backy. So without going off into a big tangent, that was just looking at the sagittal plane, not even looking at frontal plane and transverse plane motions, because the hamstrings, even though the knee is called a hinge joint, the hamstrings are really, really active, kind of like the reins on a horse, right? So my bicep fem can control that knee diving in, and then also knee coming out, the medial hamstring group can kick in. So we do have to really start to expand that sphere and get out of the sagittal plane, because the hamstrings do a lot more than just concentrically flex the knee. So how we're going to parlay that information into the true stretch, and again, if you don't have a true stretch, you could do this by putting a door or a chair in the door jamb, anchor your hands in the door jamb, and now you could start getting into what we're talking about. So based on what I said earlier, when we look at the influence of the knee and the hip on the hamstring, a lot of hamstring mobility is being done in a straight-legged position, right? So bending down, really rounding, and I can get my hands down there. And I'm not the most flexible, but I'm also not the most restricted. But when I start allowing my pelvis to posteriorly tilt, I'm technically shortening my hamstrings from my hip down, but my hamstrings are stretching from the knee up because my knees are locked, if that makes any sense. The opposite would be this. If I soften my knees and I now anteriorly tilt my pelvis, a lot like a deadlift, now I'm stretching my hamstrings from the top down. So which is going to be more applicable to life in terms of knee and hip position? Well, when I walk, my front leg is softening and absorbing force. I'm ideally not doing it in a stiff-legged posture, right? So knee soft, hip is going to tip forward, going to put some nice load onto that hamstring. I'm going to utilize that technique in the cage. here, I'm gonna put my hands in front of me, and I'm just gonna start driving my pelvis back. Now, as I do that, I actually wanna keep an arch in my lower back, or emphasize that arch by rotating my pelvis anteriorly, right? Because now I'm moving my sit bones, my ischial tuberosity, or the origin, further away from my knee, right? So that's gonna put more load onto the hamstring from the top down. I'm not focused on trying to lock out my knee and trying to get my hamstring to tug from the knee up. I want more hip down because, again, from an authenticity standpoint, that is the true, more purposeful function of the hamstrings and how we load them. So when the hands are in front, I'm going to arch my lower back. My knee does not have to lock out, and I'm just going to start driving that pelvis backwards and just start teaching my hamstring to start to load from the hip down as opposed to from the knee up. And then in the good old three-dimensional way, I can start to now shift my pelvis right to left. And now I can just start having a frontal plane influence into the hamstrings, right? And then transverse plane, I can open and close the door and start getting that nice rotary load going through the hamstring complex. And now all of a sudden I have a whole new world, a whole new sphere of load going through this hamstring. And I can come on out of here and go, whoa, man, that just feels really, really, really different. So I explore you guys to just think about how do we stretch the hamstrings, right? You know, straight-legged pancakes and things like that are great, and we utilize them in here too. But I can't only use very knee-dominant hamstring type stretches or that straight out leg posture to stretch my hamstrings. I do need to teach my hamstrings how to load from the hip down. And then you'll be surprised at how life starts to occur differently. Maybe the deadlift pattern starts to change and all those hinge patterns start to get that much easier, or maybe your back doesn't bother you as much. So just be mindful of that. Keep that pelvis nice and arched as you're getting into your hinge, and put the load on the hamstring, which is where it should be. So enjoy that stretch, give it a whirl. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. And as always, thanks so much for listening. See you next week.